I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today, on Thanksgiving weekend, we've still got a slew of great topics for you to discuss. First, Amber is going to be talking about Trump's tariff plans. Second, I'm going to be talking about Jack Smith dropping the January 6th charges against President Trump. Ben is going to be talking about the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and then Inez is going to be talking about the potential right to die legislation in Britain. So we'll kick it off. We'll go straight to Amber.
Thanks, Will. So yes, Trump has announced some phases of his new tariff plan for when he takes office. He's going to sign an executive order, he says, immediately to institute these plans, one of which is to put a 10% across the board tariff on China for a combination of economic and national security reasons. And then he also plans to threaten Canada and Mexico with a 25% across the board tariff. And this is intended to get those two countries to enforce their side of the border. Now, in Trump's first term, he took a different approach to getting Mexico to play ball with enforcing its side of the southern border, which was he threatened to pull foreign aid from them if they did not use their military to stop the cartels. And AMLO folded pretty quickly on that. So given the fact that Mexico is hugely reliant on the U.S. for a trade partner, I believe about 80% of their exports go to the United States. Although the new president of Mexico claims that she's going to fight this and that it's actually the U.S.'s fault that the border is bad, which is, I mean, true to a degree, but certainly not when Trump's going to be in office. I find her posturing to be a little bit out of sorts and probably not in keeping with what would happen if Trump were to actually move forward with instituting these tariffs. There's also a lot of pushback to Trump's tariff policy because of the assumption that it's going to significantly raise prices on American consumers. And I'm sure some of y'all have thoughts on this too. But when we look at the specifics of US tariff policy, it's not the case that a 10% tariff is going to lead to a 10% increase on your Barbie dream house or whatever it is that is coming from China. The tariffs are mostly on component parts that make up a larger product. So you're already looking at a smaller percentage of the product that is facing the tariff. And then there are usually other countries that make the component parts that are not subject to the tariff, which is kind of the whole point, which is getting our supply chains out of China and into countries that are more friendly. And then also reshoring American manufacturing more generally through the USMCA that Trump negotiated during his first term. And then beyond the fact that it's just component parts, you also have that the US tariff policy is based on the first sale price as opposed to the last sale price. So pretty much every other country, when they implement a tariff, they're putting that 10%, let's say, on the final product, right? The Barbie dream house, after all the component parts go into it, the last sale price. Or if it's on component parts, they will wait until it goes through every single middleman and the part gets significantly more expensive throughout that process. So let's say China sends it to Taiwan, who then sends it to the US. They would put the tariff on the sale from Taiwan to the US, not China to Taiwan. We actually put it on the first sale. So again, the prices are not going to increase as much as people are saying. If I think just to throw out some hypothetical numbers, if you're looking at a 10% tariff on a component part coming from China, the end product that gets sold in the US might be 1% higher at best. So we're not looking at another round of massive inflation like has been suggested by the Nobel Prize winning economists who just hate Trump and hate tariff policy in general and have for the past, 4 decades. But all of that being said, I would love to get the group's thoughts on these initial tariff policies and what you think the outcome is going to be. We did see Trump put in tariffs during his first term. Biden kept a lot of those tariffs in place. And yet the inflation that we've seen over the past 4 years is largely due to the massive government spending through Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Plan, et cetera. So I'll open it up to the group.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this. One is a really 30,000 foot thought, which is that there are a lot of policy areas and just kind of issues in the United States that I think follow this structure right now, which is there's a tremendous amount of reliance on a system that isn't working, right? But nevertheless might be very painful to undo in the short term, but is necessary to undo in the short term. And I think there's a larger political question here of how, Trump goes about doing some of these things. Like, there are frankly plenty of sectors of the economy that probably are operating on the sort of premises of the way the economy has functioned for the last 30 years, which Americans have just said overwhelmingly just does not work for them, right? So I think there's a sort of high level problem that Trump is dealing with, which is, how to manage politically the short-term pain that comes with undoing some of these systems, even when people say they want them undone, right? It's an interesting problem in a democracy, right? And the good news, I guess, on that front is that he's coming in with a lot of goodwill to do it. If you look at polling about the incoming Trump administration, his picks and so on, some polls are showing, 18 points favorability. That is a return to, I know people always like to talk about norms. That's a return to a pre-Trump era and really pre-malaise norm of the American people feeling optimistic at the beginning of a new presidential term, but it's not something we've seen in the last few cycles, that kind of generous benefit of the doubt. Trump is coming in, and I think that's connected to the strength of his win and the fact that, virtually every demographic shifted more Trumpy in the election. So I think he's in a good political position to try some of these things. And I think that the American people are not stupid, and they will give him some leeway and understand that, that there may be some short-term consequences. I think, for example, deportation is another one of these, right? Of course, the pain of these things, whether it's inflation or in prices or, sobbing families or whatever else, is going to be amplified as much as possible by the legacy media and by people who hate Trump. We'll see how that whole political dynamic continues to work out when you're trying to change the underlying structural issues and things that have been in place for decades. There is going to be a lot of turbulence, I think, in the early part of the Trump administration. Specifically, I'm not an expert on tariffs, obviously, but this and the deportations, what interests me in these truths, I guess they are, this also suggests to me that he has a team behind the scenes, and maybe Will can speak more to this, that is actively coming up with good legal arguments to give Trump the widest possible latitude. I noticed he framed the tariffs in terms of national security. That's, I think, intentional and on the legal advice, right? Because usually this would have to go through Congress. But if it's a matter of national security, then courts have given much more latitude to the executive to deal with that. So it suggests to me that he has some smart people whispering in his ear about the legal difficulties he's likely to face, and trying to give himself and the administration the widest possible executive latitude to do some of these things, because as we know, things go to Congress to die.
I think that's a good insight there. That there is intentionality to this. It's not simply reactive, but there's a method behind the madness, so to speak. But it's really not mad. It's very sane, actually, to say that when you're coming into the presidency, if you wish to effectuate non-economic changes among those in your near orbit, you're going to use every potential tool in the toolbox, and that includes economic ones, economic measures. So I think, on the one hand, this is sort of the classic negotiating tactic that we saw in the Trump 1 administration of use tariffs to effectuate changes because we haven't used this stick as much as we ought to potentially. But it's an opening bid in a negotiation. And if you look back, I'm pretty sure there's actually some direct quotes of Trump in the past talking about the fact that it's not that he has great love for tariffs necessarily, but this is a tool to even a playing field and ultimately negotiate down so that you actually have genuine free trade. Now, obviously, this is not a free trade emphasis. This is about what's a tool, a leverage point that the U.S. has to get, in this case, Canada, China, Mexico, to respect our sovereignty, our national interest. So why wouldn't you use every potential tool in the toolbox? So it's refreshing to have a president that's actually willing to do that. This strikes me as a shrewd tactic to potentially use. And we've already seen in any number of instances worldwide that the mere impact of Trump being the president-elect has caused other countries to recalibrate their policies in ways that are more favorable to our national interest. I think we're going to see the same thing ultimately with tariffs. And, you know, we can obviously talk about what's going to be the impact on prices, tariffs or taxes for consumers, et cetera. Who knows if we'll even get to the point that the tariffs have to be slapped on these other countries. But to the extent they are, I think there's a compelling argument to be made to the American people. Would you rather have a country, or would you rather have cheaper goods and not be a sovereign country anymore? And I think at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons that Trump was elected. It wasn't necessarily framed in that way, but this is what the American people voted for. And so I think this is completely consistent, obviously, with the MAGA agenda, with putting Americans first. And again, people are willing to pay, I believe, potentially slightly more for products to have a nation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Ben, which is that tariffs are not just an economic policy, but they're actually a values-based moral policy. And it's a question of what you view your country as being for. Is it just a marketplace for goods? Or is it a place where you actually want people to have meaningful work, where you build things and you give people a sense of purpose through their jobs? And that's an element of the equation that often isn't talked about by these high-minded policy wonks who just want to talk about dollars and cents.
That said,
I
if we
think
could also get rid of the income tax wedded with it, I'd be cool
yeah,
with that too.
great
Well,
point.
yeah, that's a good point, Ben, because that's what I was thinking when I was thinking about the structural, you know, there's so much precedent in US history for high tariffs. That being said, there isn't a lot of precedent for high income tax and high tariffs. And I think there's going to be a balancing game here between things that, you know, Milton Friedman, old school libertarian Republican style juice the economy and the GDP that Trump is also in favor of, like deregulation and tax cuts, coupled with tariffs that may have, for example, national benefits, but economic pain associated with them, right? So like, I think there's going to be an interesting and delicate balance between that, because certainly, you know, one of the things that won Trump the election is the memory of the Trump economy versus the economy we've been dealing with for the last 4 years. So
we're going to go ahead and move on to the second topic, which Will is supposed to cover, but I think he's having some internet issues being in rural North Carolina. So I'll take the help on that one, I suppose, but leave it mostly to a group discussion. So Jack Smith has filed a motion, which I believe has been accepted by a judge, to drop the charges against Trump related to his conduct on January 6th. Still to this day, can't really explain what exactly he was being charged with, I guess obstruction of justice. But what I find most interesting about the motion from Jack Smith is that he actually left the door open to bringing charges again after Trump leaves office for the second time. Will he do that? I don't know. But the fact that he did not make clear that this case was officially over was pretty interesting to me. So I'll let the group weigh in. Do you think that this is dead for good, or did Jack Smith do this intentionally to kind of keep Trump on his toes, or does he actually intend on perhaps bringing charges again after Trump leaves office?
Well, I'm curious to hear Inez's legal take on this, but the critical language was dismissed without prejudice. And when you read, beyond the fact that arguably Jack Smith mischaracterized the case, you know, he talks about Donald Trump, he maintains that he was a private citizen when these acts, alleged criminal acts were committed, set aside the lunacy of the case itself. Essentially, Jack Smith shows zero contrition or repentance. He won't concede anything about the merits of the case. He basically says, this is a legitimate case, but my hands are tied because the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel has written advisory opinions. And by the way, it's going to be really interesting to see if the Trump DOJ actually cleanses the opinion put forth, or the advisory notice put forth by the Office of Legal Counsel with respect to can you charge someone, can you continue to indict and prosecute someone who is about to become the president again? But Jack Smith does leave the door open, and this is completely consistent with the zealousness of Smith. Smith has gotten smacked down, by the way, I believe unanimously before the Supreme Court before in pursuing political figures as well. So this is very on brand and characteristic for him. Another question to the Trump DOJ would be, is there anything you can do to quash this so that there is not a zombie case that's ultimately re-upped? What about the statutes of limitation here? That's another question that's interesting. I think the statutes of limitation, when you look at the four different charges at play, was 5 years. I don't know if they're sort of frozen in time or not from when the charges were brought and then during the pendency of Trump's presidency. These are all open issues, but this is disastrous for the rule of law, in my view. The same thing might persist with respect to the New York case with Judge Merchan. Is that going to be a case that's going to be hanging out, as everyone has said, as sort of a sword of Damocles over Donald Trump's head for when then he returns to private life? Same thing, by the way, of course, with the Fulton County, Georgia case as well. And then last but not least, it's also worth noting, on the other hand, for two of the other defendants in that case, the case persists. So once again, you have the Biden-Harris DOJ persisting in its view that these cases are legitimate and continuing to go after effectively their political opponents. So how is the Trump Justice Department going to react to this is going to be a very interesting question.
So yeah, my understanding is the same as yours, Ben, and maybe Will can shed some light on this now. He's joining us by phone, but my understanding is this is a sword of Damocles. It's the hedging your bets that the political fortunes will change eventually, right? And first of all, that makes it extremely clear that the case is political, right? The same thing with a lot of the like the shuffling on of either of these cases legally or in the media as well. After Donald Trump's victory, somehow they're melting, right? Could not be clearer that this is not about the law, that it was a political prosecution. And that's, I know that we all talked about this for weeks and weeks and weeks, but this is kind of the final truth that, in fact, this was not about the law or nobody being above the law. It was about pursuing your political opponents using lawfare as a tool. I mean, in terms of the DOJ, to me, this is just one more reason. This kind of sort of Damocles situation is just one more reason why, Pam Bondi has her work cut out for her. And it's going to take a very serious cleaning house at Department of Justice to ensure that that department continues to work actually to uphold the law, as opposed to what it has become, which is really just an arm of one political party to pursue their political opponents. And it's been, very, very depressing to see that happen in the United States of America. It's not something I ever thought would happen in this country, but it is a difficult and it's kind of like what we were saying about the tariffs, right? Difficult and delicate job that is necessary in terms of punishing people who have abused their positions within the DOJ to go after Americans they disagree with politically. And then in terms of actually like structurally changing the Department of Justice to make sure this can't happen to him in the future and can't happen, more importantly, to a whole bunch of other Americans who fall under this purview, right? Things first to coming to mind, parents who objected at school board meetings, pro-life protesters who prayed silently, right? Like there wasn't just Trump that there was political and legal warfare against. It was really what his strongest argument has always been, which is he was just the figurehead of pursuing Americans who hold views that in one way or another might agree with some aspect of what Donald Trump stands for.
Will, if we have you here on the phone, please weigh in.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, my internet, my Wi-Fi collapsed on me, so now I'm dealing with a single LTE bar. So we'll see how this works out.
I cannot hear Will. Can anyone else hear him?
I think we've lost him again.
Okay. Well, in that case, I think we will just move on to Ben's topic, which is covering the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire.
Thanks. And, I want to focus on the U.S. role in this purported ceasefire, which by all accounts appears to have been imposed on Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by the Biden-Harris administration. This has been part of an Iran first policy that I've been talking about since the podcast started, essentially, wherein you've had the Biden administration laboring for years to fix Hezbollah's position in Lebanon and essentially privilege it over Israel. Back in 2022, you had the Biden administration force the so-called maritime deal, which was favorable territorial lines for Lebanon and by extension Hezbollah, which affect state there, relative to Israel, including giving it access to these waters wherein there's substantial oil reserves. And supposedly Israel was going to get a percentage of the royalties when it was extracted, bring peace in our time. And then about a year later, you had October 7th, and you had Hezbollah's constant attacks on the Israeli north, which has rendered the Israeli north uninhabitable and uninhabited by tens of thousands of people who've been rendered refugees in their own country, but the Biden administration won't never talk about that. So the administration has been laboring for months to try and force some kind of détente between Israel and Lebanon, with Israel responding to Hezbollah's attacks, then obviously crippling Hezbollah ultimately in recent months with decisive decapitating leadership, destroying the strategic infrastructure of Hezbollah. And this is obviously critical because Hezbollah is sort of the paw for Iran right on Israel's northern border. If you neutralize Hezbollah, you really, to a large degree, but not fully, neutralize Iran's best option for deterring Israeli action. But the Biden administration, instead of letting Israel win, fully and decisively win, has imposed this ceasefire, and they've done it in a couple of different ways, according to the reporting. One is there's been a soft, quote, arms embargo against Israel, and Israel reportedly, by a number of accounts, is really running short of the hardware, ammunition, etc., to defeat Hamas, Hezbollah, combat Iran, and beyond. So you have the arms embargo as one aspect, and another aspect is threats of UN resolutions coming down the pike that could lead to crippling sanctions on Israel, and that reportedly could potentially even survive with the Trump administration coming in less than 2 months. This ceasefire was imposed and forced on Israel, essentially. And under the ceasefire, Israeli troops are going to leave Lebanon. Hezbollah forces are to be removed north of essentially Khan River. There's a UN resolution that was supposed to have created this in the first place, where there's a UN quote-unquote peacekeeping force that was supposed to ensure that Lebanon, that Hezbollah forces did not go south of that river and threaten Israel, Israeli north. But essentially, this goes back to a status quo. Israeli soldiers have to leave. They can't win. And supposedly there's going to be an advisory council or an oversight council, so to speak, with the U.S. and France, for example, basically watch to see if there are violations of the ceasefire. And Israel remains adamant that any movement from Hezbollah to rearm, to threaten Israel, can be met with and will break the ceasefire. And there's been competing reporting about whether the U.S. has the same interpretation. We'll see how this goes in a less. But I think this is a shameful capper to the first agenda, where you have the Biden administration laboring to do everything possible to and defend Hezbollah rather than seeing it destroyed. Hezbollah, which we might add, have hundreds of Americans on its hands back to the 1980s with the Beirut barracks bombing, killing hundreds of American armed forces there. And for an Iranian regime, of course, that has the blood of hundreds of Americans on its hands, namely from the IEDs that it helped produce in connection with the Iraq or the Afghanistan war, and of course the recent attacks on U.S. troops in the region. So I think it's a shameful and despicable. This is analogous to what Barack Obama tried to do to put this at the UN at the very end of his second term. And the question is going to be, to what extent does this materially impact things? Let's say this ceasefire does persist up until the point of Trump being in. And of course, it's a 60-day ceasefire. Assume office in less than just under 60 days. To what extent does this help Iran/Hezbollah harm Israel? Or is this just sort of going to be a temporary pause and then Israel's going to do what it needs to do to decisively win, or the Trump administration is going to come in and neutralize Iran in other ways. We'll have to see. But last but not least, it's worth noting Israel maintains that this is positive because this now de-Hezbollah Lebanon war from the Hamas Gaza war. And Bibi Netanyahu maintains that he's going to be able to now more effectively focus on Iran. We'll see if that's a cope or if that's real. And the Biden administration is signaling that it's going to do everything it can to work overtime to, again, force a ceasefire in Gaza and protecting Hamas. So in its waning days, trying to protect Hamas, trying to protect Hezbollah, and of course, by extension, protecting Iran. It's a shameful and despicable episode from my vantage point, but curious what you all think.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is inheriting a world on fire. This is only one of the fires that he's inheriting, and it does seem like the Biden administration is trying to entrench. The kindest interpretation would be that the Biden administration is trying to lock in certain of its priorities before the incoming administration, which of course contravenes the purpose of the lame duck session and of you're supposed to be preparing for the transition of power and trying for the sake of the country to make it as smooth as possible, not trying to throw up roadblocks. But it would be nothing new, right? From the petty to the very important, there is plenty of precedent for outgoing administrations to try to lock in what it sees as its priorities, especially in foreign policy. But I mean, that's the kindest explanation. The less kind explanation is that it would look too bad for them if even by the time Trump assumed office, the world looked much calmer than it did for the entirety of the 4 years under Biden-Harris, right? That would make it so unequivocally clear that it's their foreign policy, their decision-making, their weakness on the national stage, coupled with big words on the national stage. Like they have that worst of all worlds of the kind of logical possibilities for Teddy Roosevelt's maxim about speak softly and carry a big stick, right? They have to speak loud and carry a tiny twig. It is not a good it's not a good combination, right? To be very sort of grandiose with the way that you talk about defending even goals that are utopian, like human rights around the world, right? And then like sort of provoke other actors on the world stage without any intent of actually or even serious buildup of our capability of actually going to war, great power warfare, right? So this kind of the worst possible combination, and this could make it very, very clear, just like the hostages in 1979 being released just before Reagan took office. It makes it very, very clear that the personality of the president, even laying aside some specifics about policy, that the personality of the American president matters very much. His relationships with world leaders and the respect or contempt they have for him is very important, and not in the way that we're always hearing from European polling about like how every Republican president is or whatever, but in a very like world leaders men in a room behind the scenes kind of way, that the personalities of these people really, really matter. That being said, I'm still hopeful. I guess I'm with the plus 18% I mentioned, that I'm still hopeful that Trump's touch in foreign policy will calm the world and will also result in a stronger America, a stronger Israel, and in terms of our allies in the Middle East, and a worse situation for America's enemies like Iran. But it's a tough thing he's inheriting, both domestically and foreign policy. I mean, I hope the leeway that the American people give him will be enough. Like they'll give him enough time to before they judge some of the results of his actions, because he is inheriting a very, very, very tough situation, both foreign and domestic.
Yeah, and as you brought up the idea that if Trump is able to calm a lot of these situations around the world, despite the Biden administration trying to entrench their policy, that it will become very obvious that it was their failures at foreign policy that caused the chaos that we're seeing now. And I wanted to point out in reference to that several of Kamala's top campaign advisors just did a podcast with Pod Save America, where they're supposedly going through the things that they got wrong on the campaign trail, how Kamala could have differentiated herself from Joe Biden and basically where everything went wrong. And throughout this entire podcast conversation with 4 of these campaign officials, not once did they talk about foreign policy and the fact that the US is tangentially involved in 300% more wars than they were when Trump left office. And so I think that's very telling about how little they credit those issues with the failure of the Biden administration, particularly when, if you go back to the Afghanistan withdrawal, that was actually the moment that Biden's approval rating first cratered, and it never recovered after that, because it was a sign that the adults in the room, competent, new administration, was all a lie, and it was laid bare for not just America, but for the whole world to see. And with that, I will kick it right back to you, Inez, for your coverage of the UK debating whether or not to enshrine right to life laws. Or excuse me, right to die laws, the exact opposite of what I said.
Yeah, this is really just a reference to the United Kingdom is only to kick off the topic. I think this is going to be along with the pot legalization, is going to be one of the sort of culture war battles of the next 10 years. And so the Brits are looking at a right to die legislation, so-called. It has a number of pretty strict limitations in the bill language. That being said, we've seen those limitations erode very, very quickly in other examples. But for now, it's people who are expected to die within 6 months. Although the language there's some debate, at least as far as I can tell, as to how tight that language actually is. Expected to die within 6 months. And this bill is going to be a free vote, which means that the political parties are going to allow their members to, basically it'll function more like the US system, but it'll just be a straight vote, and everybody will be able to vote their conscience on this issue. I think this is an important issue to bring up, because a couple aspects of it. First, I think it is one of the most pristine examples of Mott and Bailey, and of the importance sometimes of hypocrisy or prosecutorial discretion. And I'll explain what I think about why I think that in a minute. But two, I think it is sort of it will follow the same track as the pot legalization debate, which I know I myself have changed my mind on. I was very sort of libertarian on this. Even 5 years ago, I thought like this doesn't really affect me. It's a substance somewhere on par with alcohol in terms of intoxication. Like this is sort of, why are we putting people in jail for this? And then seeing the social destruction that legalizing pot in our cities across the country, and then in a lot of states at this point, has caused, I've like very much changed my mind on that. I think that the structure of these culture war issues of the future are going to test how well libertarian messages that even 2 years ago, I think, were very popular to the extent, same thing on, for example, on pot. What we've seen is like that actually the power of that argument is still crusting, but it is crusting in polls as people see the actual consequences of it. But the instinct of everyone is to say, well, why is this a problem? How does it affect you? Those kinds of libertarian arguments. I think this is very, very similar. We already have 10 states and Washington, D.C. that have assisted dying / right to die legislation. This is not a new issue in the United States, but I think it will take that same structure where you have people saying, well, why is that, making the very individualistic argument, who are we to tell people how they can and cannot die, right? So I think it's a very dishonest way in a lot of cases, but in this one in particular, of making that argument, because what's at issue in all of these cases, and much more strongly actually in the right to die case than in the pot case, is not actually the ability of people to do certain things that are technically against the law. There is no rash of prosecutions of people who are giving a beloved family member an overdose of morphine at the end of their life when they're in enormous pain, regardless of how you feel about the moral parameters of that question. The only time those cases go to prosecution is when there's a disagreement within the family, right? So that is not, there's no like mass problem with throwing people in jail for doing this merciful act, which is the thing that's always out in front when we discuss this issue of euthanasia, euthanizing human beings, right? It is the case of somebody who's in extraordinary pain in the last days of their life, and the choice before them is a supposedly more merciful and painless death as opposed to a drawn out and painful death. And that's not really what these bills are about. It's about shifting the moral responsibility for suicide away from the individual and to society, and to basically bless it. And I think it's going to follow the same path and pattern as LGBT stuff, right? Where it started out as an argument about what people do in their bedrooms, in a very libertarian argument, and America largely agreed with that argument. And then it turned into, actually, you can't avoid the question of where the societal imprimatur goes. And the law is a huge part of the societal judgment about a certain act. There is no ability of the law to stop anyone in the US from shooting themselves in the head. It's a little harder in the UK. You have to become more inventive in your methods. But there is no law that prevents people from committing suicide. What the law prevents is this blessing of suicide and the transfer of the act to a kind of modernized, medical establishment. And of course, and I'm sure you guys will weigh in on this, and especially I think Amber probably has thoughts on this, but of course there's all of the potential for abuse and for persuasion, and the question of what to do when all of us at some point, when we're very young and when we're very old, and if we're lucky, not in between, become a physical burden on others, right? And there's the enormous sort of slippery slope in terms of encouraging people whose existence is inconvenient or expensive for the medical system, especially in a socialized system like the UK, right? So of persuading them that it's actually better for everyone if they take themselves out of the equation. But I just want to open this discussion. I suspect it's a discussion we're going to have more in the United States, because it just strikes me as one of those arguments that gets to the heart of maybe the shift in the conservative movement in the last 10 or 15 years, which is away from seeing these issues as only about individual liberty and individual rights. What made me want to do this topic was The Economist writing a piece that said it's one of the cherished liberties, right? To choose when you die. That's not the original understanding the American founders had of liberty. But I think it has been the understanding of liberty that has been dominant in the United States since the 1960s and been on the rise since the 1960s. And I think is now cresting. And I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel those arguments hit very differently than they did several years ago when someone says, well, how does this affect you? Because we've seen on so many different issues how it does end up affecting us when supposedly individual decisions are made with societal imprimatur.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think that argument has really fallen flat for a larger swath of the population than it would have maybe 5 years ago. One of the things that always strikes me about these right to die bills is that they always have this this caveat that the person who wants to die has to be of sound mind, right? Like they can't be going through a psychotic episode or something of the like. But there's something, inherently, if you want to die as a human being, you're not of sound mind, right? Like I think it's a necessary contradiction, because you're going against everything that is innate to being a living being, which is that you want to live, you want to survive. And if your mind is telling you that it's time to go and you're actually going to take actions to make that happen, then you don't fit the sound mind requirement. So the laws in and of themselves, from a philosophical basis, I find that to be flawed. But then I think from a more anecdotal standpoint, if any of us on this podcast have ever had a pet that they've had to put down, you have to make these really difficult decisions, right, about the pet's quality of life and their how much time they have left to survive if they have some kind of terminal illness. But there's a huge difference between deciding to not put your cat on dialysis when it has kidney disease because it's a cat and it's time to let it go, versus a human being who actually has an ability to communicate with doctors and the ability to go on dialysis and potentially survive for years and years, right? And when you think about, again, if you've been through the situation, the grief that you go through and the constant questioning of yourself when you do put that pet down, of did I do it too early? Did I make the right decision? Was there a possibility if I had spent X, Y, and Z dollars at the vet that they could have actually been comfortable for longer and I could have enjoyed them? To extend that then to humanity, which is immensely more complex, and you're talking about things with souls and the ability to reason and logic, putting that burden on society as a whole, as Inez put it, is beyond disturbing. And I can only imagine the collective guilt that our population would suffer if we had to be in charge of making those kinds of decisions, really ultimately on behalf of other people, because it would be the state approving or disapproving of people's desire to die.
This is obviously a fraught topic, and to do it justice, you have to do kind of there's the religious analysis, there's the more secular ethical analysis, there's the law and philosophical analysis. Very difficult, and obviously at a very micro level, if and when anyone has had a family member who's been in the kind of state where you could understand that the suffering was so horrible that they felt that they weren't really living life. It creates major quandaries, and if we could have solved them as human beings, then we wouldn't be having these massive debates about it now. I would just say my 2 cents, because to go to weigh in on this issue, I think requires being probably better steeped in all the different arguments and sides of it to do it justice. But I would just say, is it a sign of a healthy society wherein the notion of essentially right to effectively commit suicide and the right to commit infanticide are cherished perceived rights, and that for some, these are issues that are life and death, literally, issues for them? Is that a sign of a healthy society? And the other point that I would make is obviously the law expresses a certain morality in and of itself. So the implications of legislation on this do go far beyond, this is a personal choice and kind of the libertarian, well, it doesn't really impact me sort of thing. The law ultimately does impact everyone, and it does express a certain sentiment in a society and reflect the underlying values and principles of it. So it does matter. I mean, it's not one-to-one with the marijuana usage. And I do think, to Inez's point, we've seen the societal consequences of the liberalization. We also know that the drug's much harder than it was, and it has all of these terribly disastrous impacts on the users and ultimately on society. That's almost a much more clear-cut issue than this one, I think. But I suspect, and as you're right about kind of the political trends on this and where kind of the new right, so to speak, is going to shake out versus the more quote-unquote libertarian-leaning right of the past.
Ben, I'm going to kick it right back to you because we're going to move to final thoughts, and I'm going to give you the prerogative to go first.
Thank you. Well, on a sunnier note, I think we have an awful lot to be thankful for. I know that, speaking personally, this election season sort of restored some of my optimism for the American people, that they would say enough is enough. And this is up and down ballot. The pendulum has swung back in many ways. Still, there's a massive climb ahead to really restore and refound this country. But it's very heartening to see that in the face of a behemoth force in our ruling regime, that there was a massive repudiation and rejection. And now, of course, the real fight actually begins. But I think we have an awful lot to be thankful for there, thankful for this podcast and our audience. And the last thing I would point out, just another thing, a sort of happy point to shine some light on is these appointments of RFK Jr. and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, which broke last night before we recorded this podcast, to run NIH. The turnabout as fair play, the sort of cosmic justice here of a couple of the folks who were the targets par excellence of the censorship industrial complex, of a rotten and corrupted and frankly tyrannical anti-science public health establishment, that those targets are now actually running the very agencies that targeted them. There's a real justice there. And obviously, of course, you have in President Trump, the person who was not only targeted by the censorship industrial complex, but the lawfare apparatus and the entirety of the administrative state writ large, and literally almost faced death for it a couple of times. It's really kind of a remarkable, miraculous time in American history, and that's something that we should cherish and not take for granted.
Yeah, and continuing the Thanksgiving theme, I agree with Ben completely. We have so much to be thankful for in this country this round. I mean, the mere rejection of the path that we were on, that I think every week started to become repetitive. The number of Rubicon crossing questions that we were considering, to the point where the Rubicon became the complete cliche that you couldn't bring up because simply there were no more ways to say we live in a banana republic. I am just enormously thankful that the American people have rejected that path. Like Ben said, it's going to be a long road and a very delicate road. And that's maybe the theme of my remarks. This podcast has been, it's going to be, there are going to be missteps. We are talking about not just a transition between an R and a D for the last, 30 or 50 years even. We're talking about a very fundamental challenge to the basis of politics and the way that our government has functioned, and our society has functioned for decades. So this will be a change-making election. We'll see what that change brings us, but I'm incredibly optimistic in comparison. It's not that I'm an overly optimistic person generally, but in comparison to 4 or 5 weeks ago, I just feel so justifiably optimistic about the potential future of this country. And when our decline seemed so terminal and in some ways so inevitable and systemic, that inevitability does not seem like one anymore to me. It seems very possible that we may have an American revival in another American century. Far from guaranteed, but even having the possibility of returning to America's greatness is incredible. I'm incredibly thankful for it and very, very grateful. So.
Yeah, me too. Everything feels a lot lighter since the election. And I also feel very optimistic. And just to lump in with y'all's Thanksgiving, thankful, sharing what you're thankful for. I think in addition to the optimism about policy and the future of the country, I have been really charmed to see the way the culture has embraced Trump and America First ideas this time around, whether it's the athletes doing the Trump dance, or even earlier this year, Harrison Butker, the Chiefs kicker, giving this commencement speech where some people were furious that he suggested some women might prefer to have families. His jersey skyrocketed to one of the most sold on the team behind Patrick Mahomes, if not in the NFL. And the owners of the Chiefs stood by him and even gave him a salary increase, making him the highest paid kicker in NFL history. And you see more MAGA hats around. You see more Trump signs in what would be considered deeply blue areas. And the normalization of that, I think, speaks to this latitude you were talking about, Inez, throughout the podcast, which is the American people probably giving Trump a fair amount of grace because of the seemingly insurmountable challenges that he has to face and the short amount of time in which he has to do it. The fact that you see the culture embracing Trumpism in a more significant way than at any point in the past 8 years suggests to me that is going to be the case, that he is going to have a little bit of some sympathy from the American people as he tries to navigate these very difficult challenges. That's going to do it for us this week on NatCon Squad. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. And on behalf of Inez, Ben, Will, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you next week.